Stevie down here at Berniston Auto Wrecking doing the junkyard crawl in Berniston, Massachusetts. And do you remember the 1980s? I do. They were the best of times. They were the worst of times. And this is a Dodge Daytona Turbo-Z. Now, the Daytona was built between 1984 and 1993, and the Turbo-Z was the top tier model. Now, of course, the term Z and Daytona are deeply loaded terms in the world of muscle cars. Daytona, of course, 1969 Charger Daytona wing car, and in the 80s, the Z28, the IROC Z, and the 280Z were the cars this thing was going up against. In fact, here is Motor Trend right here. This is from 1983, and basically what we see here is the first edition right here of the brand new Daytona. Now, the Daytona was based on the K car, had the same coil spring, straight axle in the back, but if you see right here, these 4-lug wheels, these were seen only on 1984s. The 1985s went to the 5-lug wheels, seen right there. So that was a step in the right direction. Let's take one quick look right here. This is what we had to work with in 1983-84. The Daytona Turbo-Z with 146 horsepower, the Z28 Camaro in the top right with, I think, something like 160 horse, and then, of course, the 5-liter Mustang in the bottom right there. And going further, you know, there were dark, dark days, really. But this is as good as things got. These are the cars right here that kind of kept America power shifting. And, you know, the turbocharged front-wheel drive Mopars, unfortunately, were as good as things got. There were no rear-wheel drives, no Challengers, no Chargers, none of the LH platforms that we have today, or the LX platforms. But we can see right here the specifications, 0 to 60 in 8.2 seconds. At least Dodge was done with the 0 to 50 trick they were pulling with the Charger 2.2 in the earlier 1980s. So they would actually say 0 to 50 in 9 seconds, which is like 0 to 60 in 13 seconds, but at least they were going legit with the 0 to 60s. Now this one here, again, being a Turbo-Z, is the top tier model. The price on this was $11,301, which was actually $199 more than a base 5-liter Mustang with the GT package. But for that money, you got a pretty trick interior. I'll go around the other side, but it has a pretty interesting interior for the time. The seat, standard equipment on the Turbo-Z, had a little interesting pump ball. This thing right here, this is the thigh and lumbar support. This thing right here, it looks kind of weird, like a doctor's instrument, but this was standard equipment. The thigh and lumbar, you'd turn this right here and either dial up more or less pressure on the thigh or lumbar for better seating. This is pretty high-tech stuff in 1986. Now this does have a 125 mile an hour speedometer, and that was actually a big deal because you got to remember that the Camaro was 85 miles an hour until 1988, and the Mustang had an 85 mile an hour speedometer until 1989. So, you know, the Daytona was a little bit ahead of the curve there. Now this one does have the performance dash, and up here we see the turbo boost gauge right there, showing 14 pounds, 7 to 14 is the red zone. You know, and that was part of the picture with the turbo car, boost and boost lag. But this was as good as things got. 5-speed close ratio transaxle, and again, these are front-wheel drive cars. This again is based on the K car, which is the car that Chrysler really saved Chrysler, if you will. Now keep in mind there were 44,366 Daytonas built in 1986. Of them, 5,984 had this T-top roof right here, which cost an additional $342. So, you know, it was a pretty sporty package, but again, this was $199 more than a 5-liter Mustang GT. At the back of the car, the Daytona Z had the spoiler equipment right here all the way around, and something kind of neat, standard equipment on the Daytona Turbo-Z were these ground effects skirts right down here. Now these are also known as fences right here, and this stuff is factory stock. And what these did was two things. These helped to give the car a 0.32 coefficient of drag, which is actually better than an F-16 fighter plane, so said Chrysler and Dodge back in the day. But they also allowed Dodge to claim a lower ride height. So when SCCA showroom stock racers used these things, they could claim the ride height of the rocker was lower. So this was a cheat right here that allowed Chrysler to, again, claim that the SCCA guys could have the car down quite a bit lower. So Kind of a cool thing, 2 jobs, 1 stone. Now this does have, again, the 5 lug wheels, which arrived in 1985. The 84 Daytona had 4 lugs, as did all K cars. But again, this same wheel here was used on the GLHS Omni and a variety of other high-performance Chrysler. The only bummer is that we see a drum brake in the back, and yeah, disc brakes arrived in 1987, so drums in the back, discs in the front. Speaking of the front, let's take a walk up to the nose of this thing. And this is where we're going to see the ubiquitous 2.2 Trans 4. But unlike the basic 2.2, which had something like 96 horsepower, the turbo on this one, which is tucked down in the back, brings things to 146 horsepower and 170 foot-pounds of torque. Now on these things, to verify what engine it was born with, go to the VIN's 8th spot. You see an E, it's a turbo car, but here's the bummer. The very next year, 1987, an intercooler was added to the picture, which brought power from 146 up to 175. But it is cool to see functional items like the hood, this device right here, this sort of duct. This is fed by a duct on the top, and this little tiny ramp here actually tucks air and points it down onto the turbo. This is stock equipment. You'll find it on all turbo 2.2 K cars. Kind of weird, but again, that little tiny shoehorn looking thing right there actually ducts air at the turbocharger to cool things down. So a lot of weird stuff going on. So let's take a peek underneath this thing. Now again, this is a K car. We're gonna walk down into the pit. And K cars arrived in 1981, I believe it was, and they basically ushered in Chrysler's front-wheel drive revolution, evolution, de-evolution, you call it. But here's the thing, no 8 3/4, no Dana 60s. This is the beam axle found on all K cars. Coil springs at each end, but not independent, pretty rudimentary stuff. I mean, it did the job, but with that said, this was really not nearly as evolved as, well, certain Hondas and imported cars that had independent rear suspensions. But Chrysler was learning, you know, they'd eventually go to independent rear suspension. But here's the gas tank made of steel on this one. They went to plastic a couple years later. Single exhaust running down the middle of the car. Catalytic converter would be right here, but up front, something kind of interesting. Do we have front-wheel drive? We'll trade places here, Shane, but we'll see right here, on the turbo cars, they had equal length half shafts. Now, one thing about front-wheel drive cars with performance and stick shifts is torque steer. The equal length half shafts get rid of that problem. Now, here's the deal. On the driver's side, the half shaft is this long right here, and the same length is seen on the passenger side, but there's a Band-Aid. this half shaft, same length, but this is an intermediate shaft right here with a support in the middle that is the thing that makes this an equal length half shaft right to left kind of a deal. And right here, something kind of interesting. This is the hydraulic shock absorber right there, not for the tires, but rather to control engine rock on the manual transmission Daytona Z. Turbo-Z. Now at the front of the thing, well, look here, and you know, back in '69, the Charger Daytona had that nose, the big wing on the back. Well, Turbo-Z had a chin spoiler right here, not seen on regular Daytonas, and the blacked out headlight treatment. So these cars in 1985, 86, and even 84 were about as mean as it got. The thing is though, this Turbo 2.2 was also available in the Chrysler Town & Country convertible, K car, also in certain minivans, and even the Omni GLHS. As Dodge's hottest performance model for 1986, quarter-mile times were about 15.8 or 9 seconds, about a second or two away from a 440 powered Charger Daytona of 1969. But you know, Chrysler was trying. Now, Chrysler did offer a variant of the Daytona called the Laser, but it was never offered with top-tier Turbo-Z stuff, although you could get the Turbo 2.2 in your Laser if you wanted it. Now, production on these things was, again, 44,366 units, of which 17,595 were Daytona Turbo-Z. So these were fairly popular cars. Roughly 4 in 10 Daytonas in 1986 were Turbo-Zs like this one. You know, it's a special car, and I dare say that with the passage of time, the K cars are becoming interesting to collectors, and good, clean examples are worth their effort and time in purchasing. This one is probably savable. It's an original paint example, but it does have classic New England rust. But that's the story of the Dodge Daytona Turbo-Z, not to be confused with a Z28 or an IROC. And in fact, the IROC Z, of course, we know went away in 1990, I think it was. was. And of course, a thing called the Daytona IROC RT arrived in 1991 to replace the IROC picture going from Chevrolet to Dodge. So again, the IROC thing was used on these as well in the last few years. But anyway, that's the story of the Daytona that wasn't quite a Charger Daytona. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the Steve Maggs YouTube channel. There's lots more to come here at Burleson Auto Ranch.